My parents completely skipped my grandfather's funeral. A few hours later, they posted a photo lounging on a Hawaiian beach with the caption, "Living our best life." Right at that exact moment, a text lit up my screen from my grandfather's phone number. It read, "Sweetheart, come to my house immediately." Porch. When I got there and pushed open his front door, what I found inside stopped me completely in my tracks. Before I tell you what was waiting for me, let me know in the comments where you are watching from today. If you have ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your peace of mind, make sure to hit like and subscribe. My name is Belle, and I am 32 years old. Porch. A torrential downpour washed over the prestigious grounds of Westview Cemetery in Atlanta. The freezing rain soaked right through my black mourning dress, chilling me to the bone. I stood completely alone next to the open grave of my grandfather, Elijah. To me, he was never just a grandfather. Porch. He was a self-made billionaire in logistics and real estate who built a massive business empire from the ground up through pure grit and an exceptionally sharp analytical mind. He was my mentor, my protector, and the single person in our family who truly saw my worth. Porch. When I was 10 years old, sitting on his lap in his grand mahogany office, he started teaching me how to read financial balance sheets. He taught me the true value of earning every single dollar, while the rest of our family sat back, perfectly content to wait on their monthly handouts. Porch. The cemetery grounds were vast and quiet, with no sound except the steady rhythm of rain beating against the large black umbrellas held by the groundskeepers. They waited patiently at a respectful distance, giving me a moment to say goodbye to the man who raised me. I looked around at the manicured lawns and polished marble headstones, feeling a heavy weight press down on my chest. Porch. Where were they? Where was my mother, Vivian, who spent her entire life flaunting my grandfather's wealth around the local country clubs? Where was my father, Charles, who followed her every whim and never dared to speak up? Where was my sister, Chanel, the golden child of the family, and her arrogant Wall Street broker husband, Preston? Porch. They had promised they would be right behind me in the funeral procession. Just this morning, dressed in tailored designer mourning clothes, they looked me in the eye and swore they would be there. Yet here, under the green canopy, row after row of folding chairs sat completely empty. There was no grief-stricken daughter giving a eulogy. There was no heartbroken sister shedding tears. Porch. Just me, shivering alone in the cold rain, holding a single white rose. I stepped forward and placed the flower on the polished mahogany casket. I quietly whispered a thank you to the man who taught me everything about integrity and hard work. As the groundskeepers began their solemn duties, I turned back toward my car, feeling a deep, hollow ache taking over. Porch. My heels sank into the wet grass with every step. I climbed into the driver's seat, my hands shaking against the steering wheel. I needed to know why they were not here. I needed some kind of explanation, any excuse at all, whether a flat tire or a medical emergency. Anything that could explain why they abandoned the patriarch of our family on the day he was laid to rest. Porch. I reached for my phone on the passenger seat and wiped my wet hands on my wool coat. Looking for some reassurance or at least a logical update, I opened up Instagram. I figured maybe Chanel had posted a quick story about being stuck in traffic, having car trouble on the interstate, or dealing with a sudden illness. Instead, the first post on my feed hit me like a ton of bricks. Porch. It was a picture of my mother, my father, Chanel, and Preston. They were not stuck in Atlanta traffic, and they were not dealing with an emergency. They were standing on a pristine white sand beach in Hawaii. Bright tropical sunlight beamed behind them. They were all wearing coordinated designer resort wear, holding colorful drinks topped with paper umbrellas and fresh fruit. Porch. Huge, carefree smiles spread across their faces, looking as if they did not have a single worry in the world. The caption underneath read, "Living is our best life." The location tag checked in at an exclusive 5-star luxury resort in Maui. I stared at the screen in utter disbelief at the level of disrespect. Porch. My mother had actually skipped her own father's funeral, the very man who funded her extravagant lifestyle, just to sip cocktails on a tropical island. A wave of intense anger washed over me. I zoomed in on the picture and saw Preston. He was standing there with his usual smug grin, his arm draped possessively over Chanel. Preston was an investment broker who constantly looked down on me and my career, dismissing my auditing work as nothing more than counting other people's money. He loved playing the role of the Wall Street financial genius, claiming he was managing and protecting the family fortune, and my parents practically worshipped him for it. They treated him like royalty simply because of his credentials and the high society image he gave my sister to show off on social media. He was likely the one who orchestrated this entire trip, convincing my mother that a somber funeral would be too draining for her delicate nerves, and that a spontaneous getaway was the proper way to handle their grief. I scrolled down through the comments. They were filled with praise from their social circles, local church friends, and country club acquaintances. Everyone was leaving heart emojis, applauding my mother for taking time to focus on personal healing. None of them knew the reality. None of them knew that they left me completely alone in the pouring rain to lay to rest the man who gave them everything. It was all a curated performance for their wealthy peers, hiding the uncomfortable truth behind a polished facade. A wave of disgust hit me. While the earth was still being laid over my grandfather's casket, they were brazen enough to share vacation photos. It showed me that their self-interest truly had no limits. I tossed my phone onto the passenger seat and buried my face in my hands. A frustrated scream escaped my chest, echoing inside the small car. How could they treat him like this? How could they lack basic human empathy and respect? I sat in the dark cemetery parking lot for what felt like hours, listening to the heavy rain drumming against the roof. The sound normally brought comfort, but today it only magnified the overwhelming silence. I tried to steady my breathing, fighting the urge to call my mother and demand answers. I already knew exactly how that call would play out. She would answer with performative concern, twist my words, call me dramatic, and accuse me of trying to ruin her healing process. She was an expert at turning things around to make my genuine hurt seem like an overreaction. I was too exhausted to engage in those mind games. I wiped the smudged mascara from my face, reached for the ignition, and decided to head back to my small apartment to tune out the world for a few days. Right as I turned the key, my phone buzzed sharply on the passenger seat, cutting through the steady patter of the storm. I glanced over, expecting an automated work email or a generic condolence message from an extended relative. I picked up the phone and looked at the screen. My heart stopped. The air left my lungs completely. The text message had come directly from my grandfather's phone number. I stared at the name Elijah on the screen, my mind scrambling to make sense of something impossible. My grandfather passed away 4 days ago. Just 20 minutes ago, I watched his casket being lowered into the ground. His phone had been turned off and placed in a secure lockbox by his legal team. There was no way he could be sending a message. My hands shook so much that I could barely swipe to unlock the screen. I had to wipe the glass twice because of the cold rain and nervous sweat on my fingers. I opened the thread. The text was short, direct, and gave me chills. "Sweetheart, come to my house immediately." I read those words over and over, searching for any logical explanation. Had someone hacked his private phone to pull a cruel joke? Did his attorney turn the device on and accidentally trigger a scheduled message? But why say, "Come to my house immediately"? The phrasing and tone were exactly how my grandfather used to speak to me. He always called me sweetheart, and he always spoke with that calm, unquestioned authority whenever he needed me to show up. A deep chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the weather outside. My grandfather's sprawling estate in Buckhead was supposed to be completely locked down. The attorneys had secured the property while preparing for the formal reading of the will later in the week. No one was supposed to be there. Yet someone was using his private phone, and they were expecting me. Porch. I shifted into drive, my tires slipping slightly on the wet pavement, and sped out of the cemetery. The heavy grief and anger I had been carrying was suddenly overtaken by pure, adrenaline-fueled curiosity. I navigated the slick Atlanta highways, heading straight for the exclusive neighborhood of Buckhead. Porch. The windshield wipers swept back and forth against the downpour, but my mind was moving even faster. As I drove, the deep-seated friction between me and my family ran through my head. It had always been this way. I am a 32-year-old financial auditor. I spend my days analyzing complex balance sheets, verifying corporate compliance, and uncovering hidden discrepancies in financial records. Porch. To my grandfather, my career choice was a huge point of pride. He valued hard work, transparency, and accountability above all else. To my mother and sister, my career was an embarrassment. They saw auditing as boring, tedious work meant for ordinary employees. They constantly reminded me that I was failing to elevate the family name. Porch. In our upper-class social circles, appearances and prestige meant everything. My mother, Vivian, was obsessed with maintaining the image of a polished socialite. She spent her days attending charity luncheons, wearing designer labels, networking with prominent alumni, and making sure everyone in town knew she was the daughter of a billionaire. Porch. When Chanel married Preston, my mother treated it like a major social victory. Preston was an investment broker with a flashy smile, high-end luxury cars, and a knack for using complex financial jargon that easily impressed my parents. They never cared about who Preston was behind closed doors or how he treated others. Porch. They only cared about the supposed prestige his financial background brought to the family portfolio, and how it raised their status at the country club. They constantly compared me to Chanel, asking when I was going to stop wasting time on spreadsheets and find a wealthy partner to secure my future. Porch. They told me my financial independence was just an excuse for not being able to secure high-profile connections. My grandfather, Elijah, always saw right through their obsession with status. He built his empire during an era when a black man had to work 10 times harder just to get a foot in the door. Porch. He always told me that wealth means nothing without the discipline to manage it and the integrity to protect it. He warned me repeatedly that Preston was an opportunistic talker who could not be trusted. My mother refused to listen. She handed over significant influence to Preston and blindly trusted his financial advice, letting him handle accounts she barely understood. Porch. I was labeled the difficult one simply because I valued substance over appearance. I refused to participate in the superficial social games, choosing instead to build my life through honest, dedicated work. Because of that choice, they treated me like an outsider, keeping me at a distance whenever they could. Porch. As I turned onto the private, tree-lined street leading to my grandfather's estate, my heart pounded hard against my ribs. The thick canopy of oak trees blocked out the remaining daylight, making the winding driveway feel like a dark tunnel. The massive iron gates stood ahead in the downpour, guarding the property in silence. Porch. I did not know who sent that mysterious text, and I did not know what was waiting for me inside that dark house. One thing was certain. My family thought they had handled everything. They thought they could leave me alone at the cemetery and run off without any accountability. They assumed I was just a quiet auditor who would accept the slight and fade into the background. Porch. They were completely wrong. I pulled up to the security keypad and rolled down my window as the cold rain hit my face. The real story was just beginning, and I was ready for it. I entered the familiar 6-digit code into the glowing keypad, shivering as the rain ran down my neck. Porch. It was a combination of my grandfather's birthday and my birth year, a code he had used for as long as I could remember. The screen flashed red, followed by a sharp buzz. Access denied. I tried again, pressing the metal button slowly to make sure my wet fingers did not slip in the rain. Red light. A harsh buzz. Access denied. A sudden realization hit me. Someone had changed the security code. Porch. The attorneys would never do that without notifying the family, and my grandfather certainly had not changed it before his passing. Someone else had come here, and they wanted to make sure no one else could get inside to see what they were doing. I sat in the idling car while the rain hammered the windshield. Porch. They thought changing a digital code would keep me out of the one place I always felt welcome. They forgot that my grandfather was a practical man of traditional habits, who never relied entirely on modern technology. He always kept a physical backup. I put the car in park and stepped out into the pouring rain. Porch. I walked over to the large stone pillar where the keypad was mounted, where my grandfather had shown me a secret years ago. I moved to the back of the pillar, feeling along the base for a loose section of mortar. My cold fingers searched the rough stone until I found the small gap. I pulled the loose piece out and reached into the hidden cavity. Porch. My fingers closed around a heavy, cold piece of brass. The original master key. I unlocked the pedestrian gate next to the main driveway and slipped inside. I chose not to drive up the long lane to avoid alerting anyone in the house. Walking up to the main residence was rough. The wind whipped wet hair across my face, and my heels sank into the muddy grass. Porch. The large stone mansion loomed ahead, dark except for a faint, flickering light coming from the east wing. That was my grandfather's private study. I approached the heavy oak front door and quietly inserted the brass key into the lock. With a smooth, quiet click, the door unlocked. I stepped into the grand foyer and closed the heavy door behind me. Porch. The house was dead silent, but the space felt disturbed. My wet shoes squeaked against the polished marble floor, so I slipped them off and left them at the entrance. I walked barefoot down the long hallway toward the study. The flickering light cast shifting shadows across the walls. Porch. As I got closer, the quiet was replaced by faint sounds. The rustling of paper, the dull thud of heavy objects being moved, and the urgent whispers of an argument. I pressed my back against the wall just outside the open door of the study, holding my breath to listen closely. The first voice I recognized made my heart stop. It was my mother. Porch. She sounded frantic, out of breath, and deeply irritated, complaining about breaking a nail. Then I heard Chanel complaining that the dust was ruining her designer coat. Finally, Preston spoke up, his voice dripping with condescension as he told them both to quiet down and keep looking because the lawyers were arriving in the morning. Porch. I stepped into the doorway, and the scene before me completely defied logic. My mother Vivian, my sister Chanel, and my brother-in-law Preston were standing in the middle of my grandfather's private study. They were not in Hawaii. They were not sipping cocktails on a tropical beach. Porch. The social media post was a complete fabrication, an alibi created so no one would look for them while they skipped the funeral. They faked an entire luxury vacation just to slip into the house while the earth was still fresh on his grave and search through his estate. The study was in complete disarray. Books had been pulled from the mahogany shelves and thrown onto the floor. Porch. The portrait of my grandmother had been taken down from the wall, exposing the heavy wall safe behind it. Preston was kneeling in front of it, wearing latex gloves, pressing a stethoscope to the metal door, while carefully turning the dial. My mother was tearing through the drawers of my grandfather's antique desk, stuffing jewelry and thick envelopes into her oversized designer handbag. Porch. Chanel stood nearby holding a flashlight, complaining about the lack of cell service in the room. I could hardly process the scene unfolding in front of me. These were the same people who criticized my lack of social ambition and looked down on my profession. Yet here they were, rummaging through an empty house in the dark. Porch. They spent years lecturing me about class and dignity, expecting me to fit into their narrow definition of success. They presented themselves as pillars of the community at church functions and country club dinners, hiding their overwhelming entitlement behind designer outfits. Seeing them crawl across my grandfather's Persian rug erased any remaining ounce of respect I had for them. Porch. I stood in the doorway, rain dripping from my clothes onto the floor. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. All three of them froze instantly. Preston dropped the stethoscope. My mother slammed the desk drawer shut. Chanel gasped, dropping the flashlight as it rolled across the floor, sending shadows spinning around the room. Porch. They turned toward me, their expressions shifting from panic to defensive anger. "Belle?" My mother gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. "What are you doing here? You nearly gave me a heart attack." "I could ask you the exact same thing," I replied, stepping fully into the room. "How was the flight back from Hawaii?" Porch. "Did you enjoy the beach while your father was being laid to rest in the pouring rain?" Chanel stepped forward, crossing her arms defensively. "Our plans changed. The weather in Maui was terrible, so we came back early. We just stopped by to check on the house and make sure everything was secure." Porch. "You are wearing latex gloves and trying to break into a safe," I pointed out, looking at Preston as he slowly stood up. "You faked a vacation to skip the service and go through his property before the legal team could take inventory." Preston scoffed, brushing dust off his designer trousers. "Look at you, playing the righteous auditor as always. We are securing family assets, Belle." Porch. "Elijah was getting older, and he kept things private. We are just making sure essential documents are not lost in probate. As his daughter, your mother has every right to oversee what belongs to her." "It does not belong to her yet," I countered, my voice firm. "The will has not been read. You have no legal authority to touch anything in this house." Porch. "You skipped his final farewell just to take what you could find." My mother's face flushed with anger. "How dare you speak to us like that? We are protecting our family legacy. You know nothing about wealth management. If we leave this entirely to the attorneys, they will tie it up in probate court for years and drain the estate with fees. We are handling family business." Porch. "Family business?" I repeated, the irony sharp in my throat. "You left me entirely alone at the cemetery. You posted a fake picture to cover your tracks. You do not care about family. You only care about the money." Chanel rolled her eyes, stepping closer to her husband. "Please, Belle, stop being so dramatic. Grandfather Elijah was practically a stranger to us anyway." Porch. "He sat in this big house judging how we lived our lives. We are simply taking what we are owed for dealing with his constant criticism over the years." A cold anger flared in my chest. "He built the foundation for everything you have, the clothes you wear, the cars you drive, and the lifestyle you show off. Yet you could not even give him 2 hours of your time to pay your respects." Porch. My mother strode across the room, her eyes narrowed. She raised her hand and struck me across the face. The slap echoed sharply through the study. My cheek stung, and my head turned from the impact. I did not back down. I looked straight at her, seeing her clearly for what she was. An entitled woman, driven by desperate greed. "You are trespassing," she said, her voice shaking with hostility. Porch. "You have no right to be here. You have always been a disappointment, Belle, a stubborn girl who refused to help raise this family's profile. This estate belongs to me now. I am the primary heir. Get out of my house before I call security and have you removed." Preston chuckled, pulling his wallet from his jacket. Porch. He walked over with a condescending smirk, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and dropped it at my feet onto the damp floor. "Go back to your little apartment, Belle," he said, dripping with disdain. "Take that and buy yourself a decent meal. Let the real heirs handle the major assets. You are way out of your depth. Go back to your spreadsheets and leave the real decisions to us." Porch. I looked down at the bill, then back at Preston, feeling a wave of calm resolve wash over me. I was not going to cry and I was not going to yell. I was going to let their own choices catch up with them. For years, I let their criticism make me second-guess myself, making me feel as if my independence was a failure. Seeing their behavior tonight shattered that illusion entirely. Porch. Their cruelty came from profound insecurity, and the fact that I could stand on my own without relying on their money was my greatest advantage. I took a step forward, completely unfazed by their hostility. Before I could say another word, a calm, authoritative voice spoke from the dark hallway behind me. "That is enough. Everyone step back." We all froze. Porch. A tall, distinguished gentleman stepped out of the shadows and into the dim light of the study. He wore a dark tailored suit and carried a heavy leather briefcase. It was Lawyer Hayes, my grandfather's personal attorney and the executor of his estate. He took in the ransacked room, the open drawers, the exposed wall safe, and the cash lying on the floor. Porch. His expression was one of cold, professional resolve. "No one is leaving, and no one is taking a single item," he announced firmly. "Put everything back exactly where you found it. The will is being read right now." Lawyer Hayes stepped into the center of the study, completely taking command of the room. Porch. He walked past the pulled-out drawers, the scattered papers, and the exposed safe, setting his heavy leather briefcase down on the mahogany desk with a solid thud. "Take a seat, all of you," he instructed with absolute authority. My mother immediately tried to compose herself. Porch. She smoothed the wrinkles from her designer dress and adjusted her hair, trying to look like a dignified daughter rather than someone caught red-handed. Chanel and Preston quickly moved over to the leather sofa, sitting close together with their eyes locked on the briefcase. I remained near the doorway, the wet fabric of my dress cold against my skin. Porch. My heart was beating steadily as the silence settled over the room. Lawyer Hayes clicked open the brass latches of his case and pulled out a thick stack of documents bound in a dark blue folder. "This is the last will and testament of Elijah James," he stated, looking at each of us in turn. "This document was formally updated, finalized, and notarized exactly 3 weeks prior to his passing." Porch. A tense quiet filled the room, broken only by the sound of rain against the large windows. Lawyer Hayes began reading through the standard legal introductory clauses, confirming sound mental capacity and revoking any prior documents. Porch. He then methodically listed the full scope of my grandfather's assets: commercial real estate properties across the East Coast, a commercial transportation fleet, international logistics centers, and diversified investment portfolios. My mother practically leaned forward out of her chair, her eyes wide with anticipation. Preston leaned in with his elbows on his knees, an eager look on his face. Porch. Chanel sat back with a satisfied smirk, already imagining the luxury purchases ahead. Finally, Lawyer Hayes reached the primary distribution of the estate. To my daughter, Vivienne, he read directly from the document. Porch. "I leave my primary logistics and transport enterprise, currently valued at $40 million, along with this Buckhead residence, all personal property contained within, and the associated liquid operational accounts." Vivienne let out a sharp, dramatic gasp of triumph. She covered her mouth in mock surprise, though her eyes were filled with smug satisfaction. Porch. She turned and hugged Chanel, while Preston gave a low whistle of approval, muttering about the $40 million valuation as if he had just won the ultimate prize. They acted as though they had not just been caught trying to break into the safe minutes earlier. Their sense of entitlement was unbelievable. I stood there, feeling a dull weight settle in my chest. Porch. It was never about the money for me. I only cared about the man who was gone. Still, seeing his life's work handed over to people who never respected what he stood for was difficult to witness. Then, Lawyer Hayes turned his attention directly toward me. He reached into his briefcase and retrieved a different item. It was not a legal deed or an investment portfolio. Porch. It was an old, weathered leather briefcase. The edges were worn down, and the dark brown leather was faded from decades of daily use. I recognized it immediately. It was the original briefcase my grandfather carried 30 years ago when he first started his business, long before the corner offices and the massive wealth. Porch. To my granddaughter, Belle, Lawyer Hayes continued, his tone softening slightly, "I leave my original work briefcase, along with this personal note." He walked across the room and handed the heavy worn case to me, along with a sealed white envelope. I took the briefcase, my hands trembling slightly under its weight. Porch. The worn leather felt deeply familiar, still carrying the faint scent of his cedar and tobacco cologne. I opened the envelope, tears welling in my eyes. Inside was a single note written in his steady, deliberate handwriting. It was not a long, sentimental letter. Just one cryptic sentence. "Remember what I taught you about the numbers, Belle." That was all it said. Porch. No money, no property, no corporate shares. Just an old empty briefcase and a brief reminder about numbers. I stared at the paper, trying to understand what his final message meant. My grandfather was meticulous and never did anything without a clear purpose. Yet standing there in wet clothes with a worn-out bag, I felt completely stunned. Porch. The heavy silence in the study was broken by Chanel's sharp, mocking laughter. She pointed at the worn briefcase in my hands and laughed out loud. "An old empty bag," she scoffed, shaking her head. "An old bag and a scrap of paper. You got exactly what you deserved, Belle. Absolute junk." Preston joined in, his arrogant chuckle echoing across the room. Porch. He stood up from the sofa and looked down at me with pure condescension. "Look on the bright side, Belle," he sneered. "You can use that worn-out bag to carry your lunch to your audit job. It fits your routine perfectly. You finally have an accessory that matches your lifestyle." Vivienne stood up from the desk chair, thoroughly carried away by her newly declared status. Porch. She looked at me with open disdain, as if I were an intruder in her space. "You have always been an embarrassment to this family," she stated coldly. "This entire estate belongs to me now. I control the company, and I own the very floor you are standing on." She picked up the landline phone on the desk and dialed the front gate security post, issuing a sharp instruction to the guard on duty. "Porch. I need security up at the main house immediately," she demanded into the receiver. "We have an unauthorized individual here who needs to be escorted off the property." She slammed the phone down and walked toward me, stopping just inches from my face. "You have no legal right to be here anymore," she hissed, her eyes narrowing with absolute malice. "You are officially cut off from this family." Porch. "Do you hear me? Never contact us again, never ask us for a single dollar, and do not ever show your face at any high society gathering in Atlanta. You are an utter failure, Belle, and I am finally rid of your embarrassing presence." The heavy study doors swung open, and two broad-shouldered security guards stepped inside. Porch. They looked slightly uncomfortable, clearly recognizing me as my grandfather's favorite granddaughter, but they were bound by the strict orders of the property's new legal owner. "Ma'am," one of them said, looking at me with genuine sympathy. "We are going to have to ask you to step outside." Porch. Preston crossed his arms and chuckled, thoroughly enjoying the sight of me being escorted off the premises. What a fitting, pathetic exit for the family outcast. Chanel waved a dismissive hand. "Bye, Belle. Enjoy your dirty little trash bag." The guards stepped up and placed their hands on my shoulders. I did not resist. I gave them no tears and no scene, refusing to hand them that satisfaction. Porch. I simply held my grandfather's worn leather briefcase tight against my chest as they guided me out of the study, down the polished marble corridor, and toward the heavy oak front doors. My mother's voice echoed loudly down the hallway behind me, casting me out of the only place that had ever felt like home. "Do not ever come back," she shouted in triumph. Porch. "As far as I am concerned, you are dead to me." The guards pushed open the heavy front door and guided me out into the pouring rain. The massive wood slammed shut behind me with a cold, absolute finality. I walked down the winding driveway, my bare feet sinking into the freezing mud and wet grass. The wind drove the rain against my face, blending with the tears finally running down my cheeks. Porch. I slipped out through the pedestrian gate and listened as the electronic lock engaged, sealing me outside for good. Climbing into my cold car, I set the worn leather bag on the passenger seat and drove back to my small apartment in complete silence. I was soaked straight to the bone, shivering from both the cold and the sheer emotional weight of the night. Porch. I walked into my dim apartment, collapsed onto the sofa, and pulled the briefcase onto my lap. I held it tight against my chest, burying my face into the worn material. Hot tears ran down my cheeks, dripping onto the leather edges. I grieved for my grandfather. I grieved for the family I never truly had. I felt the full weight of the unfairness that had just taken place. Porch. As I sat there, my fingers brushed aimlessly along the bottom seam of the bag, searching for any small sense of comfort in the only possession left to me by the man who raised me. Suddenly, my fingertips hit something unusual. The base of the bag felt unnaturally heavy and uneven. I pressed my hand firmly against the inner fabric, feeling along the reinforced lining. Deep inside the construction was a dense, hard object, completely invisible from the outside. My heart skipped a beat. I jumped up, ran to the small kitchen, and grabbed a utility pair of scissors from the drawer. Rushing back to the sofa, I carefully guided the tip into the worn seam of the inner lining. I sliced open the dark fabric and parted the layers, revealing a hidden compartment tucked between the exterior leather and the lining. It was a heavy, metallic rectangular object. I pulled it out and stared in complete shock. Resting in the palm of my hand was an encrypted, heavy-duty flash drive. My heart raced as adrenaline surged through me. My grandfather had not left me an empty bag after all. He had left me the truth. His cryptic note echoed clearly in my mind. "Remember what I taught you about the numbers, Belle." He knew exactly what they would try to do, and he had given me the key to expose it all. The early morning sun peeked through the thin blinds of my apartment, casting long gray shadows across the laminate floor. I had not slept a single minute. My eyes burned from crying, but my focus was sharp, locked entirely on the encrypted drive sitting on the kitchen counter. I knew I needed a clear head and professional software to access the protected data. I decided to head into the office early to use my secure dual monitor setup and the forensic auditing tools we used for corporate reviews. I put on my sharp blue suit, pulled my hair back into a tight bun, and did my best to mask the exhaustion weighing on me. I packed my work bag, tucking the metal drive deep into the inner pocket where its weight served as a constant reminder of what was at stake. I drove through the morning Atlanta traffic, running through every possible theory about what my grandfather had documented. When I pulled into the parking garage of the high-rise where my accounting firm was located, I took a deep breath, ready to ground myself in the familiar routine of spreadsheets and numbers. The moment I stepped out of the elevator onto the executive floor, the atmosphere felt completely off. My coworkers, people I had worked beside for 5 years, suddenly went quiet and looked away as I walked past. The usual morning greetings were replaced by an uneasy, tense silence. I kept my head up and walked steadily toward my desk. Before I could even set my bag down, my manager, Mr. Davis, stepped out of his corner office with his arms crossed and an unreadable expression on his face. "Belle, in my office right now," he instructed, his voice cutting through the quiet floor. I walked in and found the head of Human Resources already seated at the table, holding a thick manila folder. My stomach dropped. I had an impeccable record as one of the top auditors in the firm, always trusted with the most complex files. "Take a seat," Mr. Davis said, without his usual morning warmth. "We received deeply concerning communications early this morning from one of our high-level financial associates. A prominent investment broker contacted the regional board directly." Preston. My blood ran cold. Preston had leveraged his network to strike first. Mr. Davis opened the folder and slid a document across the desk. "This broker alleges that you have been improperly accessing and disclosing proprietary client portfolio data to third parties," he said flatly. "The claims are detailed and backed by several notable associates within the local financial community. They are asserting that you have compromised sensitive investment accounts for personal financial gain." I stared at the document in disbelief. It was a complete fabrication, a calculated lie designed to derail my career and strip away my independent livelihood. "This is completely false," I said, my voice steady despite the surge of anger. "My brother-in-law, Preston, is an opportunist trying to ruin my professional standing over a private family inheritance dispute. I have never compromised a single file in my career. Orch, my audit logs are spotless." The HR representative shook her head with zero professional empathy. "Your administrative access has already been suspended, Belle. Regardless of the merits, the standing of the individuals raising these concerns makes your continued presence an unacceptable liability. Orch, we deal with elite clients who demand absolute discretion, and your professional standing has been compromised as of this morning. Your employment is terminated effective immediately. You are not to access your workstation or contact clients. You need to leave the premises now." I was stunned. Orch. Under standard employment agreements, the firm could dismiss me on the spot to protect their reputation without waiting for an investigation. Preston had weaponized his professional connections to dismantle the career I worked so hard to build, essentially blacklisting me across the local financial sector in a single morning. Orch. He knew I relied on my work to remain independent, and he set out to destroy it. I had to surrender my access card. 2 security guards escorted me out of the high-rise, past the staring eyes of my former colleagues. For the second time in 24 hours, I was removed from a building, my dignity undermined by people acting on false pretenses. Orch. I sat in my car inside the parking garage, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. A profound anger shook me to my core. Preston and my mother had launched an all-out campaign to destroy my life. I reached for my phone, hoping to call a close friend for support. Orch. Instead, my screen was flooded with notifications from members of our elite church circle, the influential socialites my mother spent her life trying to impress. I opened the first message from Sister Carmen, the head of the charity committee. It was a long paragraph filled with performative concern, masking heavy judgment. Orch. She wrote that she was praying for my troubled spirit and could not believe I would abandon my grandfather on his deathbed to run off with some unnamed partner. The text claimed my mother was utterly heartbroken by my selfish behavior and that I was no longer welcome to volunteer at the upcoming gala. Orch. I read through message after message, and with every notification, the twisted story became clearer. My mother, Vivian, had launched a targeted smear campaign. At first light, she had contacted influential figures in our social circle, spinning a web of falsehoods. Orch. She claimed I was a rebellious daughter who skipped the service for personal distractions, painted me as a greedy child who showed up at the estate demanding money and causing disturbances, and cast herself as the grieving matriarch, trying to hold a broken family together. She understood how high society circles operated. Reputation was everything, and gossip moved fast. Orch. Using her country club ties and church standing, she undermined my character before I even had time to grieve, turning our community against me and cutting off any avenue of support. Longtime family friends blocked my number. Acquaintances I had volunteered with for years removed me from social groups. Orch. My inbox filled with messages from distant relatives who accepted Vivian's narrative without ever asking for my side of the story. They labeled me opportunistic and a disgrace to my grandfather's name. I was completely cut off, isolated by the very community meant to provide support during a loss. My mother had made sure no one in town would hire me, assist me, or even listen to what I had to say. Orch. She wanted me broken, and forced to come back begging for her approval. She severely underestimated my resolve. Sitting in my car, reading those cruel messages, my heart broke with every word. Women I had known since childhood, who smiled and consoled my mother at the service, were now condemning me without a shred of proof. Orch. It was shocking how quickly these social circles turned on their own. Vivian knew exactly which buttons to push, using ideas of family duty and respect for elders to make my supposed actions seem unforgivable. She turned our community into a weapon, using gossip to cut off every lifeline. Orch. I could not even turn to our family pastor, who had already sent an email recommending intensive counseling before I could return to the congregation. My mother had poisoned the well, making sure I had nowhere left to turn. She truly believed this social isolation would force me to surrender. I drove back to my apartment with the full weight of their coordinated attack resting on my shoulders. In less than 48 hours, I had lost my grandfather, my family, my career, my reputation, and my entire support system. They pushed me to the absolute edge, stripping away everything I had worked for, to leave me with nothing. They forgot one thing they could never take away: my analytical mind. I locked my apartment door, securing both the deadbolt and the chain. I did not even take off my suit. Walking straight to the small dining table, I pulled the heavy-duty encrypted drive from my pocket. It felt solid in my palm, holding the answers I needed. I fired up my personal laptop, ignoring the stream of notifications lighting up my phone. I plugged the drive into the port. A prompt appeared on the screen, requesting a 32-character alphanumeric decryption key. I cracked my knuckles and stretched my neck. I was an experienced financial auditor, trained to navigate complex corporate data structures. Preston and Vivian assumed I was just a quiet girl behind a desk, having no idea what I was capable of with a computer in front of me. I launched my forensic auditing tools, running systematic scripts to work through the security layers. My fingers moved across the keyboard, entering code and parsing through the digital barriers my grandfather had put in place to protect the truth. Lines of data scrolled rapidly across the screen. I routed the process through secondary proxies I had configured years ago, the cooling fan humming loudly under the processing load. After 30 minutes of continuous work, the screen settled. A prompt appeared in the center of the display: access granted. The vault unlocked, revealing hundreds of hidden documents, complex financial models, and confidential overseas bank records. I leaned in, scanning the columns of numbers and hidden transaction logs. The reality was right in front of me, exposing a massive financial paper trail that would dismantle their polished facade. The accounts were tied to corporate entities that led directly to the very people trying to ruin me. My grandfather's note, reminding me to pay attention to the numbers, made total sense now. Numbers do not lie, even when family does. I was going to use these records to bring their entire operation down. I focused on the glowing display, reading through row after row of data. Over the past 5 years, my grandfather had kept meticulous records of every single transaction within his logistics business. With my training in fraud detection, the red flags stood out immediately. Opening the master ledger for the shipping division, I noticed an irregular pattern of outgoing wire transfers. These were not standard vendor payments or routine operating costs. They were massive monthly disbursements categorized under vague labels like overseas consulting and supply chain optimization retainers. The amounts were staggering, ranging from $50,000 in a single week to over $200,000 a month. I traced the routing numbers through the account database my grandfather had compiled. Funds were being siphoned out of legitimate corporate accounts, moving into a network of entities registered in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. Typing rapidly, I pulled the registration documents for these offshore entities. I fully expected to find Preston's name listed on the corporate filings. What I uncovered stopped me cold. The primary entity receiving the diverted funds was registered entirely under my mother's name, Vivian. A secondary holding company, used to move capital through real estate holdings, was legally tied to my sister, Chanel. Preston had kept his own name completely off the paperwork. As an experienced investment broker, he knew exactly how to conceal his involvement. For 3 years, he had been quietly draining millions of dollars from my grandfather's logistics company, funneling the money directly into accounts controlled by his wife and mother-in-law. Looking at the digital signatures and access logs, It was obvious Vivienne and Chanel had no idea these entities even existed. Torch. Preston likely slipped the incorporation forms into routine tax packets or mortgage documents, telling them to sign on the dotted line. They were so impressed by his financial credentials and so desperate to maintain their wealthy socialite image that they never bothered to read a single page. He had turned them into unwitting fall guys. I dug deeper into the encrypted folders, my frustration growing with every file I opened. The fraud was systematic and aggressive. Preston had not just skimmed profits, he had bled the logistics business dry. He manipulated corporate credit lines, took out unauthorized loans using the company's physical assets as collateral, and moved that capital straight into hidden accounts. My grandfather must have uncovered the misappropriation months before he passed. The restricted folders contained internal audit requests and draft legal filings, but his sudden decline in health prevented him from stopping Preston in time. Instead of confronting them while weak and bedridden, my grandfather secured all the digital evidence in one place, waiting for the right person to find it. He knew I was the only one in the family with the financial background and the resolve to uncover the full scope of what happened. The scale of the missing funds was breathtaking. Over the course of 36 months, nearly $18 million had been diverted. Preston used his role as the trusted family financial advisor to bypass standard corporate oversight entirely. He attended their lavish dinners, smiled, and drank their expensive wine, all while draining the business behind the scenes. My mother had handed him control and pushed me aside, simply because his background and status impressed her friends. I opened another encrypted file labeled Tax Regulatory Flagged Accounts, and the true brilliance of my grandfather's final strategy became clear. This was the financial turning point that would settle the score. The $40 million logistics company my mother had accepted with such triumphant arrogance was not an empire at all. It was a financial sinkhole. Preston had drained all actual liquidity, leaving the core enterprise buried under massive liabilities. The records showed delinquent corporate taxes, defaulted commercial loans, and heavily leveraged property deeds. The company was essentially a hollow shell teetering on the edge of insolvency. The most critical document in the folder was a confidential notice from tax authorities. Federal regulators had flagged the business for large-scale tax evasion and major financial irregularities, launching an active investigation into the missing capital. My mother was celebrating her inheritance, completely unaware that she had legally assumed ownership of an insolvent company burdened by millions in back taxes and undisclosed corporate debt. Because she rushed to sign the transfer documents without requesting an independent audit, she had legally made herself fully responsible. On paper, she was the sole owner and chief executive officer. When regulators moved in to freeze accounts and audit the business, Vivienne would be the one held accountable. When they traced the diverted millions, they would find accounts registered under Vivienne and Chanel's names. Preston had built a seamless exit strategy. He took the money, hid it overseas under their names, and positioned himself to watch them take the fall for his actions. When authorities arrived to question his wife and mother-in-law, he would play the role of the supportive, heartbroken husband, while quietly planning to leave the country with the hidden funds. The calculated selfishness of his plan was astounding. He weaponized their vanity and lack of financial awareness. They were so focused on social standing that they walked straight into a legal trap. I leaned back from the table, my mind processing the full weight of these discoveries. I had the evidence to expose everything. I could simply step back and let the regulatory authorities dismantle their operation. I could watch my mother lose her standing and face severe legal accountability for tax evasion and fraud. I could watch my sister realize that her wealthy husband had set her up to take the blame for his financial schemes. For a moment, the thought offered a sense of validation. They had cast me out into the rain and ruined my professional reputation in a single morning. They deserved the fallout coming their way. The more I looked at the files, the more I realized that letting the situation play out naturally was not enough. Preston was calculated and well-connected. If authorities investigated the company tomorrow, he would hire top defense attorneys, claim he was only an informal advisor, and argue that Vivian and Chanel were the sole operators behind the offshore accounts. He would use his professional charm to misdirect investigators while letting my family take the full burden of the penalties. He would walk away with millions while my mother and sister faced the legal consequences alone. As much as I resented their actions, I could not let Preston walk away without accountability. He was the architect of this entire scheme, and he had to answer for it. To ensure Preston could not escape the fallout, I needed indisputable proof of his direct involvement in the wire transfers. My grandfather's files were substantial, but regarding Preston's direct authorization of the transfers, much of it remained circumstantial. I needed his digital footprint tied directly to the offshore routing network. I needed communications, internal emails, or access logs showing that he personally initiated the transfers and intentionally set up the accounts under their names. I needed a clean chain of evidence that no defense attorney could challenge. I stood up and paced across the apartment floor. My mindset shifted into that of a forensic auditor, planning a calculated corporate review. I could not turn the drive over to the authorities just yet. The timing had to be precise. I needed Preston to feel completely secure. He believed that by getting me fired and isolated, he had eliminated me as a factor. He assumed I was sitting in my apartment, broke and powerless. I had to use his arrogance to my advantage. I returned to my laptop and created secure, encrypted backups of every file on the drive. I uploaded the entire cache to a decentralized server behind multiple secure firewalls, ensuring the data could never be lost or altered. I organized the records, cross-referencing each fraudulent transfer with corresponding dates, amounts, and transaction IDs. I was assembling an airtight case. Preston thought he was the smartest person in the room, believing his professional standing shielded him from consequences. He severely underestimated my grandfather's foresight and my determination to uncover the facts. As the sun rose higher and bright daylight filled my apartment, a quiet resolve settled over me. The pain of losing my grandfather and the sting of my family's betrayal were still real, but they no longer paralyzed me. They gave me focus. Vivian wanted to present herself as a powerful corporate leader. Chanel wanted to flaunt her lifestyle and marriage. Preston wanted to walk away with millions while leaving others to take the blame. I was going to let them enjoy their temporary comfort, allowing them to settle so deeply into their false sense of security that they would never see what was coming. I safely disconnected the drive and closed my laptop with a quiet click. The dynamic had completely changed. I was no longer the abandoned daughter, standing alone in the rain. I was the one holding the full truth, and I was going to see that justice was served. I walked into the bathroom, washed the exhaustion from my face, and looked in the mirror. I took a deep breath, straightened my posture, and lifted my chin. Preston and Vivian started something, without realizing who they were dealing with. They thought they had left me with nothing, but they had handed me the exact tools to hold them accountable. A full month passed since the reading of the will and the loss of my position at the firm. My mother wasted no time displaying her newly acquired position to the local community. To establish herself as the head of my grandfather's logistics company, Vivian organized the most extravagant high-profile gala the city had seen in years. The event took place at a prestigious downtown ballroom, a venue known for its exorbitant booking costs. Social media was flooded with updates. Chanel shared dozens of clips highlighting custom-imported floral displays, massive crystal chandeliers, and an elite catering service valued at over $100,000. They were spending money recklessly, completely unaware that every dollar spent was digging a deeper financial hole with the authorities. I knew I had to be there. Torch. I needed to look Preston in the eye and let him know his hidden paper trail was no longer secure. I needed to shake his confidence and force him into making a misstep before the regulatory review closed in. Gaining access to a secure private event was challenging, especially since Vivian had likely placed my name on the security list. Torch. My grandfather had built relationships with discreet, dependable professionals over the years. I reached out to an old associate of his, Mr. Carter, a seasoned operator in the business community. When I explained what Preston had done to the company, Mr. Carter was appalled. He arranged a flawless guest credential for me, under the name of a representative for an overseas shipping investment group. I spent hours getting ready for the evening. I wore an elegant emerald green evening gown that fit impeccably, paired with understated jewelry that conveyed classic refinement rather than flashy excess. I styled my hair into a sleek updo and wore bold makeup, looking entirely different from the tired auditor they had cast aside a month earlier. When my car pulled up to the valet, the attendants opened the door with immediate courtesy. I walked up the marble staircase and presented the formal gold-trimmed invitation to the security staff at the entrance. They scanned the credential, and the reader flashed green. The heavy doors opened, and I stepped into a room defined by absolute excess. The ballroom was filled with fine attire, diamond jewelry, and polite conversation. Servers in formal tuxedos moved across the floor, carrying silver trays of high-end champagne and gourmet appetizers. The room was packed with local figures, prominent community leaders, and major business executives. Standing right in the center of the room under the bright lights was my family. Vivian wore a designer gown, adorned with heavy diamond jewelry that I recognized as belonging to my late grandmother. She stood at the center of attention, laughing loudly and accepting compliments from the very people who had looked down on me weeks before. Chanel stood beside her in an extravagant couture dress, holding Preston's arm tightly. Preston looked completely satisfied with himself, wearing an imported tuxedo and swirling a glass of high-end bourbon while sharing business stories with an attentive crowd. They presented a picture of complete confidence, standing on the foundation of my grandfather's hard work and massive, undisclosed liabilities to live out their high society aspirations. I took a glass of champagne from a passing server, blended into the crowd, and moved steadily toward their private VIP section. I stopped near the edge of a large floral arrangement, watching their performance from the shadows. Preston worked the room with polished charm, making grand promises about corporate expansion and selling the exact same illusion he had used on my mother and sister. I watched him closely, noticing a subtle twitch in his jaw every time someone pressed him for specific details about the company's quarterly earnings. He was feeling the strain. Behind that tight smile, he was struggling to hold up a house of cards that was rapidly running out of time. When the string quartet launched into a louder classical piece and drew the crowd's focus toward the stage, the moment arrived. Vivian and Chanel were distracted by a photographer, posing for another shallow social media update. Preston remained at the table, casually scrolling through his phone with a bored expression. I took a steadying breath, slipped my hand inside my clutch, and held the folded document. It was time to let him know he was no longer in control. I walked across the polished floor with steady confidence, stepping past the velvet stanchions without the nearby security guards even looking twice. I approached the table from behind, leaning in close to speak directly into his ear. He did not notice me until the last second, clearly expecting another guest coming over to offer compliments. "Hello, Preston," I murmured, keeping my voice quiet and controlled. He flinched, spilling a few drops of bourbon onto the white tablecloth. He turned sharply, his eyes widening in shock as he recognized my face. "Belle?" he hissed, glancing around to see if anyone was watching. "Torch, how did you even get in here? Security was supposed to keep you out." I ignored the insult and placed the folded page onto the table, sliding it slowly past his drink toward his hand. "I strongly suggest you look at that before calling anyone over," I said calmly, keeping a polite smile for anyone watching from neighboring tables. "Torch." Preston scoffed, attempting to maintain his composure, but his curiosity won out. He unfolded the page, angling his body to shield it from view. It was a redacted summary page from the offshore accounts. I had hidden the full routing details and specific numbers, but the dates, transfer totals, and the names of the corporate entities registered under Vivienne and Chanel remained completely visible. Torch. The color drained from his face instantly. His smug expression vanished, replaced by sheer shock. His breathing slowed, and his hands began to tremble, shaking the paper he held. He looked up at me, his eyes darting frantically as he tried to figure out how much I knew and how thoroughly his records had been accessed. Torch. Your sophisticated financial persona is nothing more than a cheap shell game, I said quietly, leaning in so only he could hear. I know about the fraudulent transfers, Preston. I know about the offshore entities. I know you spent 3 years draining my grandfather's company while having your wife and my mother sign corporate filings they never understood. Torch. Most of all, I know about the $40 million tax liability you left in Vivienne's lap. Preston swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He opened his mouth to spin a smooth excuse, but the weight of the evidence sitting in front of him left him completely speechless. You are out of your mind, he finally whispered, his voice shaking slightly. You fabricated this. Torch. No one will believe an auditor dismissed for policy violations. They will believe the unredacted files submitted directly into public record, I replied smoothly, holding my smile. You thought you were clever, setting up 2 people to absorb the consequences of your financial misconduct. Torch. You thought getting me fired would silence me, but all it did was give me the time to document everything you did. Your time is officially up, Preston. Before he could answer, a sharp voice cut through the room. What is she doing here? Vivienne shrieked, her words slicing straight through the music. I stood tall and turned toward my mother and sister. Torch. Vivienne was storming toward the table, her face twisted with anger. Chanel trailed behind her, looking utterly appalled that their evening was being interrupted. Nearby, guests stopped talking and turned to watch. The ballroom went dead quiet. I gave explicit instructions to keep you off the premises, Vivienne yelled, pointing a diamond-covered hand at me. Torch. How dare you sneak in here to disrupt my event, you ungrateful, jealous child. You are trying to ruin the most important night of my life, because you cannot stand seeing me succeed while you have nothing. Preston saw an opening to play the protective husband and shift focus away from the document. Torch. He quickly crumpled the sheet of paper, shoved it into his jacket pocket, stood up, and placed a hand on Vivienne's shoulder, looking at me with manufactured pity. Vivienne, please stay calm, Preston said loudly enough for the surrounding crowd to hear clearly. Belle is clearly unwell. She was let go from her firm for mishandling confidential data, and now she is sneaking in to cause a scene. Torch. She is desperate and looking for attention. We should let security handle this quietly before she embarrasses herself further. Chanel rolled her eyes and scoffed. This is beyond pathetic, Belle. Sneaking into a private dinner to beg my husband for money. You look ridiculous. Go back to your apartment and leave high society to the people who belong here. Torch. Vivienne trembled with anger, her chest rising and falling heavily. She could not stand that I was standing there looking composed and refusing to back down under her glare. Her need to establish authority in front of her peers completely overtook any sense of decorum. She grabbed a full glass of red wine from the table and hurled the liquid straight at me. Torch. The dark wine splashed across my cheek, soaking the front of my emerald gown and dripping down my neck. A loud gasp rippled through the onlookers. Several women covered their mouths in disbelief, while others began whispering frantically. Chanel let out a sharp laugh and reached for her phone to message her friends about the drama. Preston sighed and shook his head with mock disappointment. "Orch. Someone call security," he told a nearby server. "This woman clearly needs assistance. She is completely out of control." I stood perfectly still, letting the wine drip from my chin. I did not raise my voice. I did not wipe it away immediately. I gave them no emotional reaction. I simply looked at the three of them, watching the fragile illusion they were trying so desperately to protect. Orch. They thought this public display was a victory. They thought throwing a drink proved their superiority. They had no idea the ground beneath them was already giving way. I reached into my clutch, pulled out a white silk handkerchief, and calmly wiped the wine from my cheek. I looked straight into my mother's eyes and gave her a calm, steady smile that made her take a half step back. "Orch. Enjoy your enterprise, Mother," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the quiet space. "I truly hope you appreciate what Grandfather left you. You deserve every part of it." I turned and walked away, holding my head high with absolute composure. The crowd parted naturally, giving me a wide path. Security guards rushed into the room, but they did not lay a hand on me. Orch. They simply followed at a distance, clearly taken aback by the calm authority with which I moved across the floor. I stepped through the grand doors without looking back, leaving Vivian, Preston, and Chanel standing in the middle of their event. The wine on my dress felt like a badge of honor, physical proof of how desperate they had become. The doubt had been planted in Preston's mind. Orch. He would not sleep tonight. He would be frantically reviewing accounts, wondering what my next move would be. The groundwork was complete, and the accountability they tried so hard to avoid was about to arrive. I walked out into the cool night air, took a deep breath, and prepared for the final phase. Preston did not sleep that night. Orch. When someone builds their entire life on deception, they live in constant fear of the truth catching up to them. The page I left on the table was a clear warning. He knew I had accessed the records, traced the routing activity, and uncovered the full scope of the liabilities. Instead of backing away, Preston did what people driven by pride always do. He escalated the situation. Orch. He could not accept that someone he dismissed had completely outmaneuvered him. The following morning, he went to work manipulating the narrative. He convinced my mother that I was attempting to extort the family with fabricated documents. He told Vivian that unless they took decisive action, I would spend years contesting the estate and demanding a payout. Orch. Playing on her fear of losing her social standing, he argued that the only way to silence me was to strip away my remaining stability, so I would have no resources to pursue legal inquiries. 4 days after the dinner, a loud knock rattled the door of my apartment. A process server stood in the hallway, handed me a thick envelope without a word, and walked away. Orch. I opened the folder and read the filing. My mother had officially brought a civil suit against me. She was demanding the revocation of the deed to my apartment, a modest 2-bedroom home my grandfather Elijah had purchased for me in full a decade earlier when I earned my degree. It was my only secure asset and the one place I truly owned. The legal basis was absurd. Orch. Vivian's expensive legal team drafted a claim alleging that my grandfather was experiencing cognitive decline when he gifted the property. They argued that I had manipulated a vulnerable older man and that the home rightfully belonged to the primary estate portfolio, which was now under Vivian's control. The claim was completely baseless. Orch. My grandfather remained sharp and fully capable until his final days, actively managing his logistics operations. In civil proceedings, however, leverage often dictates the pace, and they believed they held every card. Preston and Vivian wanted to leave me with nowhere to go. Orch. Knowing I had been dismissed from my firm and was living on savings, they assumed an aggressive lawsuit from a high-priced corporate firm would drain my resources. They wanted to force me into spending everything on legal defense, so I would never have the funds to investigate Preston's transactions. I sat on my sofa reading through the filing. Anyone in my position would have felt overwhelmed by the prospect of losing their home under a barrage of legal pressure. As I looked at the paperwork, a cold sense of clarity settled in. Preston thought he was orchestrating a masterstroke, but he had just provided the exact forum needed to bring everything to light. Handing the drive directly to federal investigators would have led to a lengthy review, allowing Preston to hire defense counsel, stall the process, and place the blame on my mother and sister. While the evidence was substantial, formal investigations often move slowly. I needed all of them in the same room under oath, where false statements carried immediate legal weight. By filing this lawsuit, Vivian and Preston created the exact venue for their own undoing. For this to work, I had to play the part they expected. If I arrived with an aggressive legal team, they might seek a settlement and keep the records sealed. I needed this matter heard in open court, so the documents would enter the public record permanently. I chose not to hire an attorney. Instead, I filed an answer indicating I would represent myself. In corporate litigation, appearing without counsel is generally viewed as a sign of complete vulnerability. It signaled that I was out of options. When Preston saw the filing, he likely believed the matter was already decided. The preliminary hearing was set for 3 weeks later. I chose my appearance carefully to maintain the appearance of defeat. I set aside my tailored suits and wore a simple faded cardigan, an unpressed blouse, and worn flat shoes. I pulled my hair back loosely, wore no makeup, and let the exhaustion show. The more vulnerable I appeared, the more overconfident they would be in court. When I arrived at the courthouse in downtown Atlanta, the hallway was filled with their smug confidence. Vivian waited outside the courtroom, dressed in a bright crimson designer suit adorned with gold jewelry, carrying herself like a high society figure with no sign of grief. Chanel stood beside her holding an expensive handbag, while Preston leaned against the marble wall, checking his watch as though this proceeding were merely a minor errand in his busy schedule. When they saw me walk down the hall carrying a basic plastic folder instead of a briefcase, they looked on with open amusement. Chanel let out a quiet laugh, covering her mouth. "Look at her," she whispered loudly to our mother. "She looks like she completely fell apart." Vivian smiled with cold satisfaction. "That is what happens when you turn your back on your family, Belle. You end up with nothing." Preston stepped forward, blocking my path to the courtroom doors. He looked down at my simple folder and gave a condescending sigh. "It did not have to go this way, Belle," he said with false sympathy. "If you had stayed in your lane, we would not have had to take your apartment. You wanted to push things, and now you have to deal with the outcome. Sign the settlement today and hand over the deed. It will save you the embarrassment of a public ruling." I looked down at my shoes, letting my shoulders drop and keeping my voice hesitant. "I am not giving up my home," I said quietly, making myself sound defeated. "Grandfather wanted me to have it. This is not right, right?" Vivian laughed, the sound sharp against the stone walls. "Life is not fair, Belle. You took advantage of an older man, and we are correcting the record. You are standing in there alone because you have nothing left. No one is going to step in for someone who lost their career. Step aside before I have the bailiff remove you." I stepped aside and kept my head down. They walked past me through the courtroom doors, their expensive shoes clicking against the floor, followed by their attorneys carrying boxes of prepared motions. They thought this was an easy win. They had no idea that during those 3 weeks, I had assembled a comprehensive financial file. Inside my folder was the fully organized data from my grandfather's drive. Offshore transfer logs, shell company filings bearing Vivian and Chanel's names, and specific citations of federal financial regulations. I had documented the precise flow of the $40 million misappropriation, linking Preston's digital authorizations to every single transfer. I had also submitted a formal whistleblower report through official channels, ensuring regulators had prior access to the records. I was not in that courtroom simply to protect an apartment. I was there to trigger an unavoidable legal review. I walked inside and sat at the defense table, looking small and isolated. Across the aisle, the plaintiff's table was crowded with Vivian, Preston, Chanel, and their legal team. They whispered among themselves, pointing in my direction as if the outcome were already settled. They were so focused on securing the property that they never considered the liabilities hanging over them. I opened my folder and looked at the top page. The regulatory notice documenting the $40 million debt associated with the company Vivian now legally controlled. I took a slow breath, letting an analytical calm take over. The hesitation was gone, replaced by steady focus. They were about to make statements under oath that would permanently bind them to the facts. The door near the bench opened, and Judge Crawford entered the courtroom. She was an experienced, no-nonsense judge, known for handling cases with strict efficiency. The bailiff called the room to order, and everyone took their seats. The atmosphere was heavy. I kept my head down, looking at my folder, and maintaining the appearance of a defeated defendant. Across the aisle, Vivian put on a theatrical performance. Dressed in designer morning clothes with diamond earrings catching the light, she dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, presenting the image of a grieving daughter before the judge even spoke a word. Preston sat directly behind her in the first row, completely relaxed in a navy suit with his legs crossed, watching as if this were light entertainment. Chanel sat beside him, wearing designer sunglasses indoors, playing the supportive sister. Judge Crawford reviewed the initial filings and nodded to Vivian's attorney, Mr. Harrington. The corporate litigator stood up, buttoned his jacket, and stepped forward with commanding confidence. "Your Honor," Harrington began, his voice projecting through the room. "We are here today to correct an improper transfer involving an individual in his later years. My client, Vivian, is a grieving daughter who recently lost her father, the patriarch of their family. Instead of being allowed to mourn, she has been forced to bring this action to protect the estate from someone who took advantage of his circumstances." Vivian let out a soft, practiced sob into her handkerchief. The judge offered a brief look of sympathy before turning a stern eye toward me. I held my ground quietly. They were committing fully to a narrative that would leave them with no defense once the financial facts were presented. Harrington walked the floor, arguing with dramatic emphasis. He claimed my grandfather was suffering from cognitive decline, a blatant falsehood regarding a man whose business acumen remained sharp until the end. Harrington asserted that I had isolated him from his daughter and improperly secured a downtown property without contributing to the family business. "This property represents an improper diversion from the estate," Harrington argued, holding up medical documents. Bell leveraged her position for personal real estate gain. My client, as the sole heir and chief executive of the logistics enterprise, requests the court void this transfer and return the asset to the estate. Preston leaned forward in the gallery with a faint smirk, catching my eye to silently gloat. He was convinced the matter was concluded. Harrington then shifted his focus toward my credibility, launching into personal attacks. "Your Honor, consider the background of the defendant," Harrington stated, gesturing toward my table. "While she claims to be a professional auditor, the court should note she was recently dismissed from her firm for serious professional misconduct. My mother had supplied him with Preston's fabricated allegations." Harrington presented the false claims of data disclosure as evidence of dishonesty, referencing the social fallout my mother had orchestrated. He painted me as someone acting out of desperation to retain an asset. I remained seated, letting the statements pile up on the record. When I stepped up to answer questions, My responses were intentionally brief and hesitant. I kept my answers simple, stating that my grandfather gave me the home as a gift and that I had done nothing improper. Harrington dismissed my statements immediately, highlighting my lack of legal representation. The judge listened intently, her expression growing increasingly firm. Before her sat an unrepresented individual in simple clothing facing a polished corporate legal team, presenting a standard narrative of estate disputes. Vivian then took the stand to give sworn testimony. She spoke softly, testifying about her dedication to her father and her distress over the situation, asserting under oath that she initiated the action solely to honor her father's wishes and protect the estate. Preston let out a quiet chuckle from the gallery, completely confident in the outcome. In their haste, they had formally placed on the record that Vivian assumed sole ownership and complete legal responsibility for the entire estate and all associated liabilities. Harrington concluded his presentation and returned to his seat. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Crawford reviewed her notes and looked down toward the defense table. I have reviewed the filings and heard the testimony presented, the judge stated firmly. The plaintiff has raised significant questions regarding the circumstances of the transfer. Furthermore, the absence of supporting documentation from the defense weakens the position of the defendant. Vivian reached for Harrington's hand, a look of triumph returning to her face. Chanel removed her sunglasses to watch the final ruling. Preston leaned back with his hands behind his head, satisfied with the result. Judge Crawford raised her gavel, preparing to conclude the hearing. This court finds sufficient basis to grant the petition, and the property shall be returned to the main estate. Before the gavel struck the sound block, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a resounding thud. Every person in the room turned around immediately. Vivian gasped, and Preston sat up straight, his smile vanishing. Lawyer Hayes, my grandfather's trusted personal attorney, walked purposefully down the center aisle. He carried himself with absolute authority, flanked by two tall men in dark suits bearing federal identification credentials. A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Vivian's expression turned to immediate worry, while Preston went completely pale at the sight of the federal agents. The room fell dead quiet. Lawyer Hayes stopped at the bar, separating the gallery from the counsel tables, addressing the bench directly while ignoring my mother's legal team. The agents stood quietly beside him. Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption, Lawyer Hayes said, his deep voice carrying clearly. However, I am under formal legal instructions that supersede these proceedings. Judge Crawford lowered her gavel, looking surprised by the arrival of federal officials in her courtroom. Explain yourself, Mr. Hayes, she said. You cannot simply interrupt a ruling without significant cause. I have substantial cause, Your Honor, Lawyer Hayes replied. He stepped through the gate toward the bench, reached into his briefcase, and produced a thick document sealed with deep red wax bearing my grandfather's private stamp. I present newly designated instructions from the late Elijah James, Lawyer Hayes announced. Harrington rose quickly, visibly unsettled. Objection! Your Honor, this is completely improper. The estate has been assigned and my client is the representative. Whatever documents Mr. Hayes holds have no bearing on this property dispute. We are in the middle of a ruling. Lawyer Hayes turned his head slowly, looking at my mother and Preston with complete certainty. They have direct bearing, Mr. Harrington. Lawyer Hayes countered, turning back to the judge. Because this specific instruction was authorized to be unsealed only in the event that Vivian initiated legal action against Bell. Judge Crawford looked at the sealed document, her strict demeanor giving way to sharp curiosity. She looked past Lawyer Hayes toward my mother, who was now gripping the edge of the table with white knuckles. The courtroom remained entirely still as Harrington attempted another procedural objection, which the judge dismissed with a firm wave of her hand. She leaned forward and took the thick envelope from Lawyer Hayes. Her fingers broke the deep red wax seal with a crisp snap that echoed up toward the high ceiling. She unfolded the heavy parchment and adjusted her reading glasses. Orch. The courtroom grew so completely silent that I could hear my sister Chanel's frantic, shallow breathing coming from the gallery. Judge Crawford cleared her throat and began reading my grandfather's final words into the public record. "To my daughter, Vivian," the judge read, her voice carrying clearly through the frozen room. Orch. If you are seated in a courtroom listening to these words, it means my worst concerns have materialized. It means your unyielding ambition has taken full control, and you have actively attempted to use the legal system to strip away the modest security I provided to my granddaughter, Belle. My mother let out a faint, stifled gasp, her manicured hands rushing to cover her mouth. Mr. Orch. Harrington looked utterly stunned, staring at the document as if it were about to dismantle his entire professional career on the spot. Behind Lawyer Hayes, the two federal agents stood perfectly still, their focus locked directly onto Preston, who had begun sweating profusely in the gallery. The judge did not pause to let my mother compose herself. Orch. She continued reading the uncompromising statement, her tone firm and measured. Vivienne, you spent your entire life chasing prestige and appearances. You prioritized social status over integrity, and you cast aside your own daughter simply because she did not fit into your superficial world. Your greatest oversight, however, was your blind reliance on Preston's financial persona. Orch. You handed him authority over family assets simply because he presented himself with polished charm and corporate confidence. You treated him like an untouchable asset that would elevate your standing. Preston shifted uncomfortably on the bench, his face turning an ashen gray. He looked toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the room, but the federal agents blocked the exit. Orch. His polished composure had completely dissolved. Beside him, Chanel sat with her mouth slightly open, the golden illusion of her lifestyle starting to shatter. I built my logistics business from the ground up, the judge continued, reading my grandfather's words. I spent decades navigating serious business challenges and recognizing opportunists from a mile away. Orch. I knew 2 years ago that Preston was systematically diverting funds. I watched him set up encrypted offshore accounts. I watched him drain liquidity, and I watched him register those entities using your names. Chanel let out a sharp cry from the gallery, turning toward her husband in sheer disbelief. What is she reading? Chanel cried out, her voice breaking. What offshore entities? Orch. Preston did not look at her. His eyes remained fixed on the judge, his breathing shallow. The walls of his carefully constructed financial fortress had completely caved in, leaving him fully exposed under the harsh lights of the courtroom. Order in the court, Judge Crawford commanded, bringing her gavel down firmly before returning to the text. Orch. You allowed your assets to be drained, Vivienne, the letter continued. Because you refused to look at the numbers. You dismissed the detailed, essential work that Belle dedicated her career to mastering. Because of that negligence, you walked directly into the exact outcome he prepared for you. You were positioned to take full responsibility for his regulatory violations. Orch. I sat quietly at the defense table, the simple folder resting before me. I sat up straight, shoulders back, looking directly at my mother as the reality of her choices finally caught up with her. She looked physically ill, her tailored designer outfit suddenly looking out of place. She trembled so noticeably that her diamond earrings shook against her cheeks. Orch. Judge Crawford turned to the second page of the parchment, scanning the next paragraph before reading it aloud. I watched the moment the judge realized the sheer scale of the situation. Her eyebrows raised slightly with professional recognition, and she continued delivering the late founder's statement. 3 weeks ago, you accepted the estate transfer without hesitation, Vivienne? The judge read. Orch. You were so eager to claim your title and show off your position to your social circle that you accepted the entire enterprise without requesting a single independent audit. You signed the binding transfer documents, finalizing your own legal standing. Mr. Harrington dropped his pen onto the table, the metallic click cutting through the silence. Ouch. He rubbed his temples and let out a heavy sigh, realizing there was no legal defense left to mount. Taking ownership of a major corporate entity without conducting proper due diligence was an irreversible misstep. You now legally hold a hollow company, the judge read on. Preston removed the operational capital and leveraged the physical assets to the limit. Orch. The logistics enterprise you assumed currently carries $40 million in outstanding tax liabilities and defaulted commercial obligations. By signing those transfer agreements, you assumed personal responsibility. You are the registered owner, the acting chief executive, and the primary focus of an active regulatory review. My mother let out a distressed cry. Ouch. She collapsed forward against the table, her hands clutching her styled hair as her rings scraped against the polished wood. This cannot be real, she cried out, looking desperately at Harrington. Do something. This is my company. Tell them this belongs to me. Ouch. Please remain seated, ma'am, or you will be removed from this courtroom, Judge Crawford warned, holding Vivian's gaze until she sank back into her chair, crying into her hands as her makeup ran down her face. In the gallery, Preston was visibly struggling to maintain his composure. He gripped the wooden bench ahead of him, his knuckles stark white as the federal agent stepped toward his row. Ouch. The judge looked back down at the letter and delivered the final passage. While you and Preston were focused on a compromised business, I was securing my true legacy. Over the last 18 months, I quietly liquidated my clean holdings. Ouch. I transferred $80 million in fully unencumbered, clear capital into a protected private trust, entirely shielded from enterprise liabilities, debts, and improper claims. A collective gasp echoed across the room. Regulatory authorities are not concerned with interpersonal disputes, Judge Crawford concluded, addressing the room directly. Ouch. Their sole concern is that you are the sole registered owner of an entity carrying $40 million in unpaid liabilities. This court finds entirely in favor of the defendant, Belle James. The petition to revoke the property deed is dismissed with prejudice. Vivian slumped in her seat, weeping into her handkerchief. Her position was completely undone. Ouch. Regulatory bodies would move to seize the estate, liquidate luxury vehicles, freeze domestic accounts, and auction personal assets to cover the outstanding balance. The very social circle she spent her life catering to would turn their backs immediately. She had become a cautionary tale of unchecked ambition. I sat at the defense table looking at the woman who raised me, and then cast me aside. Ouch. I felt no urge to celebrate, no overwhelming sadness, and no lingering resentment. I felt complete, grounded clarity. Their constructed world had fallen apart under the weight of its own deception. I calmly closed my plastic folder, picked it up from the table, stood up, and prepared to walk out into my new reality, leaving their self-inflicted chaos behind. Ouch. I walked through the courtroom doors, leaving the breakdown behind me. My shoes carried me steadily down the marble hallway toward the main exit. The heavy glass doors slid open, welcoming me with bright Atlanta sunlight and a fresh breeze. I stepped onto the wide concrete steps, feeling genuinely free from the toxic expectations that had weighed on me since childhood. Ouch. Before I reached the bottom, the sound of frantic footsteps echoed behind me. "Belle, please wait," a broken voice called out. I stopped and turned around. Vivian had hurried down the steps, dropping to her knees on the stone in front of me, her designer clothing tearing against the rough surface. She reached out with trembling hands, clutching my ankles. "Ouch, please do not leave me," she pleaded, tears streaming down her pale face. "We are family, Belle. You are my daughter. You have to help me. They are taking everything." I calmly leaned down and gently removed her hands from my shoes. I looked at her, not with anger, but with absolute finality. "Shared DNA does not make a family, Mother," I said softly, stepping back. "Respect does." Ouch. I turned away and walked into the warm sunlight, leaving her behind in the reality she created for herself. A full year has passed since that morning on the courthouse steps. The resolution was swift and thorough. Legal institutions do not bend for social standing, country club affiliations, or curated appearances. Orch. Preston was formally convicted of multiple federal counts involving wire fraud, money laundering, and major corporate misappropriation. The court offered no leniency for his calculated conduct. He is currently serving a 15-year sentence in a secure facility, completely stripped of his luxury lifestyle and influence. His network vanished the moment accountability arrived. Chanel found herself completely displaced by the fallout. The overseas accounts were recovered by authorities, leaving her without financial backing. Her former social peers distanced themselves immediately. She had to liquidate her personal luxury items just to cover administrative and legal costs. She currently works an entry-level retail position at a local department store, attending to the exact clientele she once looked down upon. Vivian and Charles were left entirely without resources due to the $40 million corporate liability. The authorities reclaimed the Buckhead residence, the imported vehicles, and all associated domestic accounts. They were forced to relocate to a modest motel outside the city, living with the consequences of their choices. My life, on the other hand, expanded into something meaningful and fulfilling. The $80 million trust was formally transferred into my full administrative oversight. I did not use that capital for empty luxury or performative displays. I used it to honor the man who always believed in me. I established the Elijah James Foundation, an organization dedicated to providing comprehensive academic scholarships and professional resources to ambitious young women pursuing advanced degrees in finance and forensic accounting. We provide them with mentorship, practical training, and an enduring support system to succeed in competitive corporate environments. Every day, I sit in my office surrounded by dedicated, driven individuals building their own independent paths, knowing my grandfather would be proud of the work being done. The greatest lesson I took from this experience is that true security never comes from seeking validation from toxic individuals, even if they happen to be related to you. For years, they told me that my steady dedication and independent path made me an outcast. They tried to undermine me, dismiss my work, and push me aside to protect their fragile status. Their actions only helped me develop unwavering resilience. Setting firm, clear boundaries with toxic relatives is not a sign of weakness or betrayal. It is an act of fundamental self-respect. You are never obligated to compromise your own well-being to accommodate someone else's self-interest. You have every right to protect your peace of mind, stand by your achievements, and walk away from anyone who refuses to treat you with basic dignity. Have you ever had to step back from toxic family dynamics to protect your peace of mind and personal boundaries? Share your thoughts in the comments below. You are never alone in building your own way forward. Make sure to like and subscribe for more stories about navigating family challenges and claiming your independence. Thank you for listening, and always remember that your personal integrity and self-worth are non-negotiable. Real family is defined by mutual respect, not toxic obligations. When people consistently show you their priorities, accept the reality and step forward into your own strength.